Welcome to Off the Record with me, Sanny Ntayombya. Every Friday, I bring a brand new perspective to the week's old headlines. So sit back, relax, and let's get that conversation going. But before we do, make sure you hit that follow button. And now, let's get into the very first headline. Once bitten, twice shy. That's how I feel about the American electoral process, especially the presidential polls. Why? As a naive 27-year-old, I once thought that whoever won the American presidency might somehow improve my life. However, today, as a seasoned 44-year-old, I realize American elections are for Americans, not for us here in Africa, and certainly not for those of us here in Rwanda. To think otherwise is frankly kind of stupid. I wasn't always this cynical though. Following Barack Obama's victory in 2008, I wrote in my weekly column attempting to explain his win. This is what I wrote. He symbolizes youth, idealism, and opportunity. These three things made even the most of us cynical people believers. He verbalized something that many politicians have failed to understand, that the only reason that they're there are to be of service to the people. That's what I actually wrote. I was fully on the Obama train, truly believing he might somehow be a change maker, not just in the US, but worldwide. How wrong I was. Beyond giving us the image of a black man in the White House, the most memorable things that Obama did in Africa as a two-term president included lecturing African leaders, unjustly cutting military support to Rwanda in 2012 because of the M23 rebellion in the eastern DRC. And let's not forget that he also approved NATO's bombing of Libya in 2011. That action, that NATO bombing, didn't just kill Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi and destroy Libya as a state. It also fueled a dangerous Islamist insurgency across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, killing scores who had lived in peace before Libya's fall. Since Obama, we've had Donald Trump, who famously insulted African nations as something whole countries. And then we had Joseph Biden, who not only worsened the DRC crisis with unhelpful statements, and also, let's not forget that there's a whole bunch of his inaction when it came to Sudan's civil war. So Biden's administration, if we're being honest today, probably views Africa solely as a battleground for critical minerals against Russia and China. So forgive me if I'm not emotionally invested in the upcoming presidential election. Let's look at the two candidates, Trump and Harris. Trump is a woman-hating, racist bully who dismisses the threat of global warming. Harris, however, is a warmonger unwilling to condemn the genocide happening in Gaza. Neither candidate offers anything promising for Africa. Some so-called African thinkers favor Trump, believing he'll leave Africa alone, unlike Harris and the Democrats. To them, I say, you are naive. As long as Africa is rich in critical minerals and rare earths, it will remain the playground of American interests. The difference is, one candidate might stab us in the chest, Trump, while another stabs us in the back, whispering sweet nothings as they do so. Either way, we're getting stabbed. So, as African states, Rwanda included, we need to prepare for this stabbing. Remember, we're getting stabbed. But to be able to prepare for this stabbing, we need what I call a metaphorical bulletproof vest. Anything else is kind of like playing Russian roulette with our future. And let's be honest here, it won't only be the Americans yielding the knife that will stab us, because every so-called global power will do so, whether it's the Turks, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's the Russians, Canadians, British, and or the French. we are in trouble. And to survive, African states will need to expand their internal economic capacity and fortify their security. Leaders must make it clear to their citizens that we are in a fight for survival. Why do I say this? Well, because I genuinely believe we're only a few decades away for a new wave of colonialism in Africa. Think I'm exaggerating? Look at it this way. Africa is simply too important to the world's powers for them to let us muddle along as we've had ever since 1960, when most African countries gained their nominal independence. So if, say, someone at 10 Downing Street, that's the British Prime Minister, with the backing of the White House and the Elysee Palace, decide that DRC's cobalt is too essential for their industry, defense industry, and their ballistic industry, and therefore DRC needs to be taken over militarily. Who will stop them? Certainly not the AU, certainly not the UN, and certainly not the international community. I mean, we've seen that this international community, whose weakness has been exposed by what's happening in Gaza. I mean, here I'm talking about Israel. Israel is bombing these guys, these Palestinians, and because they're being backed by the US, all the international community can do is, beg and plead for for the Israelis to stop killing and genociding these people. So let's be honest here. If if someone who's really, really strong wants to cause some real harm, there'll be very, 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 very little resistance. The world might cry and protest, but if a militarily strong nation acts shamelessly, with no shame at all, we're all in danger. So Africans need the capacity to fight back, and fundamentally, anything less is suicide. So on American Election Day on November 5th, I'll be focused on my life, raising my kids and working to get ahead. Taking my time out of my day to worry about an American election is not going to be on my list of priorities. I hope it's not on yours, because those elections are not for us. They're for them. We need to make sure that we're not the victims of the next global wave of colonization. Now, on to the next story. When I think of the world's mighty, omnipotent river systems, the Nile, the Niger, the Yangtze, the Danube, the Thames, the Mississippi, the Amazon, when I think about all these rivers, the Zambezi, when I think about those river systems, the global river systems, those are the names that come up. The Akagera. These rivers are not only vital to their regional ecosystems, but these rivers are extremely vital to the global ecosystems as well. And the idea that any of them could dry up seems almost impossible to fathom. I mean, these are rivers that have been flowing mightily since the dawn of time. So what happens when one starts to fail? Well, that's a question we've never had to answer until now. As I'm speaking to you right now, Zambians are experiencing systemic load shedding because the Kariba Dam, the country's main source of electricity, is suffering from a lack of water. People are going days without power for as long as 3 whole days at a time. For a Zambian population that hasn't faced major power disruptions in 65 years, ever since the Kariba Dam on the Zambezi River was completed by the British in 1959, this current situation that they're now undergoing must be a huge shock to their system. Now, Zambians and Zimbabweans are currently enduring a prolonged drought caused by the El Nino weather phenomenon. Now, this drought has not only affected crop yields, and right now we're seeing cases where countries, even such as Rwanda, are actually donating food aid to our Zambian and Zimbabwean brothers and sisters, this drought has not only affected food, but it has also made hydroelectric power generation on the Zambezi River, right, which is the two countries' main source of electricity, nearly impossible. Now think about it. It's as simple as this. Without water, without a running source of water, there cannot be any hydroelectric power. So because there's a drought, no electricity is being produced. Now, according to some reports, instead of producing the over 2,000 megawatts of power as it once did, today the dam is now generating only 5% of that, or just about 100 megawatts. Now, to put that in context, Rwanda, a much smaller, less industrialized country, is now currently only producing 300 megawatts of power. Now, think about it that way, from 2,000 to 100. Now, reading what Zambians are currently going through gave me much pause for thought, especially regarding the topic of green electricity and its inherent risks. Now, last year, I interviewed Dr. Fidel Ndahayo, the CEO of the Rwanda Atomic Energy Board, on my weekly podcast, The Long Form with Sanny Ntayombya. In our conversation, I learned that Rwanda has a total domestic power generation capacity of 900 megawatts. Now, in other words, if Rwanda was to fully utilize every single potential energy source in the country, methane, natural gas, solar, hydropower, wind, peat, and geothermal, we still would not surpass 900 megawatts. Now, because of Rwanda's relatively small power generation capacity and its ambitious development agenda, Dr. Ndahayo informed me that the country was now exploring nuclear power generation. When the interview and the accompanying article were published last year, I noticed a lot of pushback on social media, with many arguing that Rwanda didn't need to go nuclear since it had solar and hydropower generation capacity. Now, I believe that what Zambia is currently experiencing should serve as a lesson, not only for Rwanda, but for other African countries as well. Climate change is happening and its effects are real. Taking our water sources, right, and the benefits that they provide for granted is extremely short-sighted. We need to develop a plan B. We need to develop plan B strategies as fast as possible, and I believe that nuclear power should be part of that plan. Consider this. Nuclear power is stable. It doesn't fluctuate like other sources, right? It doesn't produce greenhouse gases, unlike, say, natural gas, coal, peat, and petroleum, and it requires much less space than solar, which obviously demands large areas for solar panels, areas that Rwanda doesn't necessarily have. So while nuclear power may have a bad reputation in Africa, the reality, the cold, hard reality, is that it plays a vital role. It plays a vital role in the energy mix outside of this continent. So like in Europe, they use nuclear. In the US, they use nuclear. Why not us? Now think about it this way. If the Zambezi, Africa's fourth largest river, can dry up due to climate change and other weather phenomena, what chances does Rwanda's much smaller Nyabarongo have? I mean, right now, and we're talking about the Nyabarongo River. Now, today in Rwanda, the Nyabarongo 1 hydroelectric power station contributes a crucial 28 megawatts to the national grid. So that's the dam on the Nyabarongo River. Then now we're also trying to do a second one, right, which is going to be called Nyabarongo 2, which is expected to be completed, actually, funny enough, next year. That one will now add another 43.5 megawatts, hopefully. Now, that is those two power stations will then be very, very essential for our development journey. Now, Imagine if there's a prolonged drought in the country. What will happen then? What guarantees do we have that things won't become as dire as in Zambia and Zimbabwe? I mean, there's no guarantee at all, and it's scary for me. So this is the way I see it. Nuclear power isn't just the future, it's the present. Waiting until things go wrong before embracing nuclear energy is like, how do I say this? Is like playing Russian roulette with our lives. And guess what? Eventually, playing Russian roulette will kill you. And I don't want to die. I think we need to go nuclear, and we need to go nuclear today. So, last story of the week. So I've read some data from the Integrated African Health Observatory, which is a platform run by the World Health Organization, that reveals that Africa has a major, major problem among all the other problems that we have. Now, according to their most recent statistics, 11.2 Africans per 100,000 take their lives every year. This figure makes our numbers some of the highest suicide rates in the world. Now, according to the released figures, the numbers are especially high in Lesotho, Eswatini, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, the Central African Republic, Botswana, Eritrea, Cameroon, and Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast. Rwanda isn't immune to this symptom of broken mental health. When you think about it, Africans have had to deal with a lot of things, including biting poverty, war, economic crisis, and the destruction of community and family ties. So when you actually think about it, it's no wonder that our mental health is terrible. Now, for Rwanda, we even have other issues. We've had to deal with genocide, civil war, forced displacement, in addition to poverty, economic crisis, and having to deal with capitalism. So how are we dealing as Rwandans with these challenges? We, 1, drink, 2, pray, and 3, pretend that everything's okay. But here's the thing. You cannot drink and pretend your way to good mental health. And despite the fact that I rarely do it, prayer is, in my opinion, at least a good way to try to improve your mental health. And you remember how in the Bible it says, lay your burdens down onto Jesus? Well, it kind of works, at least to some level. And, but the way I see it is, however, if you really want to improve your mental health, you need to acknowledge that you aren't in a good place. The challenge is, very few people want to acknowledge that they're unhappy, especially here in Rwanda, where showing weakness is frowned upon. So instead of showing weakness, we push down those bad feelings down with another shot of tequila, another puff of weed, another round of gossip, and another visit to the church. And when all that fails, well, we know what follows next. So what is the solution? We first have to acknowledge that there is a problem, a real problem. Right now, I feel like we spend a lot of time looking at the symptoms. Like I'm talking about drug abuse and alcohol abuse and and all the shady religious sects, and not necessarily the real issues, the real causes of mental health issues. So when shall we talk about, for example, absentee parents and the fact that kids are being raised by house help? Mind you, I'm not blaming parents for being absentee. After all, they need to work to provide for their children. That's just what capitalism dictates. When shall we talk about our ihangane culture, where we ask those in pain to swallow it? When shall we talk about the fact that many of us feel adrift in this fast-moving country? And lastly, when shall we recognize that we are all dealing with some sort of mental health issue? We need to be honest with ourselves. And in my opinion, honesty and self-evaluation is the start of the journey to improved mental health. So if that is the start, can we start today? I think we need to. And that is a wrap for this week's episode. Thank you so much for making it to the very end. Remember to follow us on our social media and to make sure to check out our other podcast, The Long Form with Sanny Ntayombya. It comes out every Monday like clockwork. Hope to have you back next Friday. Have a great weekend.